Welcome to Sleepless Witness, the channel where bedtime stories are slow, strange, and occasionally soaked in blood. If you've already scrolled through every calming ocean sound and meditation app and still can't sleep, don't worry. Tonight's history lesson might do the trick. We'll be wandering through Europe's darker alleyways where justice wore iron, punishments were handcrafted, and misbehaving could cost you a few fingers, or worse. No jump scares. No loud noises, just quiet descriptions of unspeakable things, said in a very soothing voice. So get cozy, dim your lights, and if you enjoy falling asleep to the sound of medieval suffering, go ahead and hit that like button, leave a comment, preferably not from a dungeon, and subscribe for more nighttime nonsense. Now then, let's begin. There is something uniquely theatrical about public punishment, especially when you look at how earnestly medieval Europe treated the whole ordeal. You see, we often imagine torture as something hidden in dungeons' dank stone walls, flickering torchlight, muffled screams echoing behind iron doors. But in many towns, especially during the height of Europe's long affair with public morality and punishment, the pain wasn't hidden, it was on display. And not just display, celebrated, ritualized, and downright festive at times. Imagine a town square not filled with cheerful stalls and fresh bread, but with a man's arms locked in a heavy oak stock, his face flushed red from the sun, his lips parched, and his eyes darting nervously as children jeered and old women threw onions. That was Tuesday. Punishment wasn't merely an outcome of crime, it was a community event. Everyone came. The blacksmith closed early. The apothecary left his mortar and pestle mid-grind. The children didn't go to school because, well, this was education. Moral instruction through other people's shame. There was something incredibly reassuring to a medieval crowd about seeing someone else being punished. It confirmed that justice existed, and more importantly, that it wasn't them this time. It's hard to overstate just how normalized this was. The pillory, the stocks, and the whipping post weren't hidden away in dark alleys. They were usually right there in the market square, next to where you bought your eggs and argued about the price of wool. Let's talk about the stocks. There were several types, and none of them were designed with comfort or subtlety in mind. The basic version locked a person's ankles in a wooden frame, forcing them into a sitting or crouching position. More advanced versions included openings for wrists, neck, and sometimes the entire body. They didn't care if your legs cramped, or if it rained, or if birds mistook your scalp for a latrine. If you were sentenced to 2 days in the stocks, you endured 2 days. You didn't get bathroom breaks. You didn't get meals unless some sympathetic soul, or confused goose, tossed something your way. Many towns allowed or even encouraged passers-by to mock, slap, or throw objects at the person in the stocks. Rotten vegetables were popular. So were rocks, unfortunately. But the humiliation was the point. Stocks weren't meant to physically destroy you. They were meant to mentally unravel you slowly, publicly, and with as many witnesses as possible. The crowd had a role to play too. They weren't just observers, they were participants. Some towns even had musicians perform near the stocks to entertain the punished. Imagine sitting with your head and hands immobilized while a fiddler plays a jaunty tune and someone sings a limerick about your alleged fornication behind the butcher's shed. The line between punishment and parody was thin, and most townspeople gleefully danced across it. The deeper irony lies in who ended up in the stocks. Yes, thieves and liars and people who owed too much tax, but also women who gossiped too loudly, men who showed up drunk to church, adolescents who insulted their elders. The category of disorderly behavior was so flexible, you could be punished for simply existing in a way that irritated the wrong person. A merchant's apprentice might get locked in for tripping over someone's prized chicken. A widow might be accused of disruptive mourning if she cried too hard at her husband's funeral. Stocks didn't just punish, they enforced conformity. If you didn't fit neatly into your community's expectations, the community would shape you, publicly, forcefully, and with tomatoes. Of course, there was also the matter of time. You weren't just locked up for an hour and sent home with a stern warning. No, punishments often lasted full days, and in colder regions, nights. You could freeze in those wooden frames. You could faint from heat stroke. If it rained, you were drenched. If the sun was strong, your skin blistered. There are records of people contracting infections or losing consciousness entirely, only to wake up still restrained. And then, if they were lucky, they were let out. If not, someone might suggest extending their sentence because they didn't learn yet. Because in medieval Europe, learning required suffering, not metaphorically, literally. But let's pause here and take a deep breath, because we've only just touched the surface of public punishment. Stocks were the entry-level tiered basic cable of medieval pain. There was so much more. Devices more elaborate, ceremonies more humiliating, and townsfolk with imaginations far darker than they should have been. If you think standing with your ankles locked is bad, wait until you meet the scold's bridle, or the jugs, or the very special punishment reserved for bakers who sold undersized loaves. And we will meet them, slowly, quietly, but not before tucking you a little deeper into the soft, horrifying embrace of history. Now, let's say you weren't a thief, or a heretic, or someone who sold bad sausage. Let's say you were just talkative, maybe a bit too talkative. Maybe you told your neighbor that her husband's hairline had fled the village. Maybe you implied that the priest's sermons were repetitive and suspiciously short on Latin. Or maybe you simply lived as a woman with opinions a punishable offense in much of medieval Europe. In that case, dear sleeper, you might find yourself introduced to a lovely device known as the scold's bridle, or as some cheery records describe it, the gossip's cage. The scold's bridle was not, despite the name, used for horses. It was a metal frame fitted around the head, something like a helmet forged by someone who failed art class but passed cruelty with flying colors. The design varied depending on the local blacksmith's creativity and passive aggression, but the principle remained the same: iron bars locked over your skull, a faceplate sometimes added. And here's the kicker: a tongue-pressing plate inside. This small, sharp, or blunt piece of iron was inserted into the mouth and held the tongue down or pressed it painfully. Try to speak? Your tongue would swell or bleed. Try to scream? You'd get silence and tears. Try to eat? Hope you like broth dribbling through iron. Some bridles had bells attached, small ones, tinkly ones, the kind you might associate with cheerful winter festivals, if not for the context. These bells jingled as you walked, alerting everyone nearby that you were wearing the device. It wasn't just a punishment, it was an advertisement. A walking PSA: this person has been deemed verbally offensive. Proceed with judgment and possibly fruit. The bells served no practical purpose beyond spectacle. They added musical humiliation to physical discomfort, and in some towns, children followed wearers down the street, mimicking the sounds, as if forming a living echo of shame. The scold's bridle was often used on women, especially those who were labeled disruptive, a word that, in medieval legal vocabulary, meant anything from arguing with your husband to expressing displeasure at being beaten by him. Some towns took great care in documenting the offenses. One Scottish case noted that the woman spoke over her husband's sentences thrice in public company. Another described a widow who was too loud in prayer. If irony had bones, it would have shattered. In some regions, the bridle was chained to a fixed point, a post in the square, a church wall, or the outside of the town hall. The wearer could not move far. They stood there, or sat if allowed, and endured. Passers-by were encouraged to offer moral correction, though this usually translated to scorn or mockery. Sometimes, the punishment lasted an hour. Other times, a day. Occasionally, if the offense was truly egregious, say, accusing a nobleman of fathering your child, it might stretch to multiple days, with breaks only for minimal food and sleeping tied up like a goat. And if you think this sounds like something out of a horror film, the records don't soften it. There are town ledgers that itemize the cost of constructing new bridles. They list the name of the woman, the offense, the length of sentence, and how many bells were attached. Some even record repairs, replacing rusted tongue plate, straightening headpiece after disuse, and so forth. These weren't improvised punishments. They were institutionalized tools of control. Manufactured shame, iron obedience. But perhaps the cruelest part wasn't the physical pain or the metal taste that lingered in the mouth for days. It was what came after, returning to normal life. Seeing the people who laughed at you, who pointed, who whispered behind their hands while you drooled in public. Many women didn't recover socially. They were seen as unstable or dangerous or cursed. Marriage prospects vanished, friendships frayed, and all because they spoke, not violently, not blasphemously, just inconveniently. So, next time you catch yourself mid-rant at your microwave, be grateful. You live in an age where talking back doesn't come with a head cage and cowbells. But don't relax just yet. We still have a few more neighborhood-friendly tortures to discuss, including iron collars, sacred chains, and the joy of standing still until your legs forget how to exist. If you've ever been forced to stand still in line at the post office, watching the minutes drip by like cooling wax while someone argues over stamps, then congratulations. You've already suffered a watered-down version of one of medieval Europe's most quietly sadistic punishments, the iron collar, also known in some regions as the jugs. Simple in concept, sinister in practice. This punishment required no blood, no fire, no bladed devices, just patience and pain. Lots and lots of very still pain. Picture this. You're marched through the village by the town constable or whatever bearded man had inherited the role of punisher by default. You're led to the church, the courthouse, or a convenient public wall. There, affixed permanently to a stone structure, is a metal collar attached to a chain. It's about the size of your neck, if you're lucky, or slightly smaller, if the local blacksmith had a dark sense of humor, which, based on surviving evidence, they almost always did. The collar opens, clamps around your throat, and locks shut with an iron pin. That's it. No straps, no seat, no padding, no snacks. Now you stand, for hours, or days, or whatever arbitrary unit of punishment the local council decided fit your crime. The collar does not allow much vertical movement, and the chain ensures you can't wander off. If it rains, you get wet. If it's sunny, you fry. If your legs cramp, you endure. If you collapse, your neck does not collapse with you. It stays locked at the exact same height. So, unless you're unusually limber, you will hang forward, gasping and whimpering and wondering which decision in your life brought you here. The iron collar was favored for its economy, no moving parts, no manpower needed to supervise, no ongoing cost. Just chain someone to a wall and let shame and gravity do the rest. People were punished for all sorts of offenses this way. Blasphemy, drunkenness, refusing to attend church, petty theft, public urination, or just generally being annoying to someone in authority. It was a catch-all punishment for minor sins, but the suffering it caused was anything but minor, and the psychological effect? Utterly medieval. Church jugs were especially popular. You see, the medieval church was deeply committed to two things: saving your soul and making you suffer in front of your neighbors first. If you offended the parish in any way, maybe you skipped Mass, maybe you arrived drunk, maybe your cow wandered into the bishop's garden, you might be sentenced to stand chained in front of the church for all to see. On Sunday morning, during service, so while the choir sang and incense drifted gently inside, you stood outside with an iron loop crushing your trachea, swaying slightly, trying not to cry, while small children threw stones and old men spat theological advice at you. It was a spiritual experience, just not the kind you hoped for. Some towns had variants. In parts of France and the Germanic states, iron cages were introduced. Not for animals, mind you, for people. These were human-sized bird cage-style frames made of steel or iron, sometimes suspended above ground, sometimes bolted to a wall. The occupant would be locked inside, often in a hunched or fetal position, and left on display for a period ranging from hours to days. These cages served a dual purpose. They punished the offender, and they reminded every passerby of what happened when you stole bread or insulted a magistrate's hat. Records show that some of these cages were placed just high enough for the occupant's feet to dangle inches above the ground, ensuring that their legs couldn't rest and their toes couldn't reach. The result? Continuous muscle strain, eventual spasms, and the delightful sensation of your body punishing itself from the inside. These were called suspension cages, and they were favored for their theatrical potential. You could hear the person groan before you saw them, like a wind chime of misery. Oh, and if the weather was unkind, too bad. There are no reports of cages being moved for rain. But there are plenty of reports of people vomiting from heat exhaustion, passing out from dehydration, and in one case, being visited by a raven who mistook a finger for an hors d'oeuvre. Now, you might ask, were these punishments effective? That depends. If the goal was to prevent future crime, the results are debatable. If the goal was to humiliate, torture, and extract a public performance of guilt, then yes, roaring success. These punishments weren't about reform, they were about conformity. They didn't whisper, "Don't do this again." They shouted, "Look what we can do to you if we feel like it." And perhaps most chilling of all, many people subjected to the iron collar or cage were never formally tried in any modern sense. No defense attorneys, no appeals. Just a town elder, a priest, or a self-important sheriff saying, "You've made trouble, now wear this necklace of pain." Some were guilty, some were unlucky. Some were scapegoats for a bad harvest or a lost sheep or the mayor's gout. Justice was less about fairness and more about visible consequence. No one had to understand the law, they only had to fear it. So next time your smartwatch buzzes and tells you to stand up for circulation, remember the ancestors who stood for 12 hours in an iron loop just to prove they didn't laugh too loud at a bishop's joke. You'll never curse your Fitbit again. We now arrive at one of the most overlooked yet disturbingly popular devices in the punishment playbook, the shame stool, also known as the stool of repentance, the sinner's seat, or in particularly creative parts of the British Isles, the repentance bench of public rebuking. Sounds gentle, doesn't it? It was not. The idea behind the shame stool was simple. If you did something that upset the community but didn't warrant mutilation or flogging, you would be made to sit, but not just anywhere. The stool was placed in the most visible part of a church or town square, often slightly elevated like a miserable throne. You, the offender, would sit upon it while the congregation, your neighbors, and possibly your livestock looked on in judgment. Some shame stools came with signs hung around the neck stating your crime: drunkard, adulterer, lazy wife, blasphemer, unclean thoughts. One unlucky soul had a placard that read, "For bragging about a pig he did not own." Accuracy, after all, was a sacred virtue. You were not permitted to speak. If you did, you risked being gagged or sent back for another session. You were to sit, stare forward, and radiate penitence. Some churches had designated Repentance Sundays, where multiple sinners would be seated together, forming a lineup of regret. A parade of personal failures, dressed in their least scandalous clothing, trying not to make eye contact with the butcher who also happened to be your cousin. This punishment was particularly popular with ecclesiastical authorities because it fused physical endurance with spiritual theater. You couldn't shift, you couldn't slouch, you couldn't yawn. If you fainted, as some did from stress or dehydration, it was considered divine commentary on your soul's burden. And children? Oh, they adored shame stools. Small boys would whisper and giggle, daring each other to make faces behind the punished. Elders would sigh theatrically. Grandmothers would weep. Nothing makes a village feel morally upright like a neighbor forced to sit still and silently radiate moral failure. It was interactive morality, live-action sin management. As the age of torture evolved, the stool would give way to more complex forms of psychological punishment: branding, debtors' prisons, exile. But the shame stool remains a prime example of communal punishment with performative flair. You weren't just being corrected, you were being made into an object lesson, a sermon with legs. And people came to watch, not reluctantly, eagerly, because, let's face it, nothing made Sunday Mass fly by faster than a little unscheduled drama, especially when it was someone you didn't like. Let's take a step back now and ask the larger question. Why was so much medieval punishment public? Why not just beat people in basements, or fine them quietly, or write stern letters with dramatic wax seals? Why turn pain into theater? Because in medieval Europe, justice was not about rehabilitation, it was about message delivery. The marketplace wasn't just for bread and gossip, It was a stage. Punishment was not only meant to hurt, it was meant to be seen hurting. The stocks weren't tucked away in alleys. They were planted in town centers, ideally near a tavern or chapel, where maximum foot traffic guaranteed maximum shame. The louder the cries, the better the moral lesson. The more dramatic the bleeding, the deeper the warning. Public punishment created a civic ritual. It united the town around a common understanding of right and wrong, and, more importantly, around a shared spectacle of someone else suffering for failing that standard. You watched, you nodded, you said, they got what they deserved, and for a moment you felt safer, cleaner, superior. But it came at a cost. These punishments relied not just on the pain of the individual, but on the complicity of the crowd. The townsfolk weren't passive, they were participants. Laughing, shaming, sometimes throwing things, sometimes jeering prayers. Children grew up with it. Adults were shaped by it. The line between justice and entertainment blurred until the two became one. That's what makes these punishments brutal, not just the iron or the posture or the rain-soaked clothes clinging to a shaking body, but the fact that they were never meant to be private. Pain alone wasn't enough. It had to be watched, remembered, gossiped about. And in that way, the worst part of medieval punishment wasn't the device, it was the audience. So tonight, as you drift off with your limbs unchained and your tongue comfortably unflattened, remember, in another age, you might have been shackled for speaking too freely, ringing like a human bell, or sitting very still while your neighbors judged your posture. Sleep tight. We've only just begun. Let's begin this part with a classic, a medieval celebrity, a true icon in the glamorous world of forced confessions, the rack. You've heard of it. You've probably seen it dramatized in films. But nothing quite captures the sheer poetry of its cruelty like the original blueprints, lovingly preserved by both the Inquisition and multiple royal torture chambers. Because if you ever needed to get the truth out of someone, or, let's be honest, any words at all, the rack never disappointed. The design was deceptively simple, a rectangular wooden frame, often the size of a coffin for giants, with 2 rollers at each end. You'd be tied to it, wrists and ankles secured with ropes connected to those rollers. Once in place, the torturer would begin turning the handles slowly, rhythmically, deliberately. Each rotation pulled the ropes taut, gradually stretching the body along the frame like dough made of nerves and regrets. At first, it felt like an intense yoga pose. Then, things began to shift literally. Joints popped, tendons screamed, muscles tore. The body's architecture was not designed for this level of horizontal ambition. Shoulders dislocated, knees unknit. And soon, the victim's frame began to elongate, sometimes by inches, sometimes by horrifying feet. Eyewitness accounts describe screams turning into wheezes, then silence, not because the pain stopped, but because the body simply couldn't produce sound anymore. But here's the elegant part: the rack didn't kill, at least not immediately. It was designed to preserve life, just enough to extend the punishment. It was the cruel cousin of surgery without the anesthesia. A doctor might cut to heal, a torturer stretch to reveal. And what was being revealed wasn't truth, it was compliance. The rack wasn't about uncovering facts, it was about breaking the idea of resistance. It transformed the human body into a graph of submission. Some racks had spikes embedded beneath the back, others incorporated thumbscrews or head restraints. The goal was total bodily control. You couldn't move, you couldn't twitch. You became an involuntary marionette, controlled by a crank and an audience of stone-faced inquisitors. Who ended up on the rack? Alleged heretics, political prisoners, suspected witches, foreign spies, peasants accused of speaking out of turn, sometimes noblemen if they fell out of favor, sometimes noblewomen if they were inconvenient. The rack was remarkably democratic. Pain didn't care for your title, only your ligaments. It also had remarkable sound effects. Contemporary descriptions mention the crackling of bone, the snapping of sinew, the wet grind of socket detachment. One 14th century chronicler wrote that the sound of the rack resembled thunder heard through fog and flesh. Medieval poetic license? Perhaps. But try reading that before bed and not imagining your shoulder blades becoming boomerangs. What made the rack uniquely terrifying wasn't just the damage, though, it was the anticipation. You watched the torturer walk to the crank. You heard the creak of wood and rope. You felt the slack vanish. And then the first pull, and then the second. And then, far too soon, you were begging not for release, but for unconsciousness, which rarely came. Even after the torture ended, the effects lingered. Some victims never walked again. Some couldn't feed themselves. Some went mad. Others confessed to anything: treason, sorcery, bestiality with imaginary animals. The rack didn't discriminate between truth and lies. It simply extracted. And once it did, no one cared about the accuracy. The confession was signed. The court was satisfied. The bones were broken. All was as it should be. And that, dear listener, is how you build a justice system if you hate people and, like furniture, that doubles as trauma machines. But don't go limp just yet. The worst is yet to come. Blades are waiting. Fire is coming. And soon, we'll meet the Iron Maiden herself, the most controversial prom date in medieval Europe. If the rack was medieval Europe's most elegant torture device, then the breaking wheel was its most theatrical. And by theatrical, we don't mean dramatic with subtle nuance. No, we mean horrifyingly public, geometrically violent, and drawn out like a 5-act tragedy written by a sadistic carpenter. Let's paint the picture. A massive wooden wheel, sometimes as large as an ox cart's, sometimes custom built for the occasion, was the star of the show. The victim, or let's say the criminal, was brought forth and tied to a wooden platform. Not just laid flat, no. Limbs were splayed out in a gruesome starfish pose, each arm and leg aligned carefully across heavy beams, leaving bones conveniently exposed. Enter the executioner, part blacksmith, part surgeon, and part performance artist. In his hands, an iron bar, or sometimes a specially forged hammer. His job was not to kill the person, not yet. His job was to break every limb at precise points, usually at the major joints by smashing them against the bones with the wheel, or by striking through the wheel's spokes. You read that correctly. The punishment wasn't the wheel running you over. That would have been merciful. The true artistry lay in the systematic fracturing of the body. One leg, then the other. Then the arms, ribs if time allowed. And each blow had a rhythm, a choreographed brutality. One chronicler from the 1500s noted that a skilled executioner could render the bones of a man into paste within 10 strikes. Others took longer, either out of clumsiness or poetic cruelty. Once the bones were sufficiently turned to mush, the victim's mangled body was threaded, yes, threaded through the spokes of the wheel, like macabre human knitting. The limbs were twisted unnaturally, tied in place, or sometimes nailed directly to the wheel's surface. Then, the wheel was mounted vertically on a tall pole and displayed like a grotesque windmill of morality. The purpose? Message delivery, again. The message was, disobey, and this is your future. The wheel wasn't just execution. It was a billboard of agony, installed for days, sometimes weeks, as the body decomposed in public view. Birds would come, weather would peel away skin, children would dare each other to look up close. The scent alone could drive people indoors, but the message was never missed. In Germany, they had a word for it, Rädern, to be wheeled. It became a synonym for annihilation. In France, they called it la roue and applied it to thieves, traitors, and the unfortunate accused of sorcery. Sometimes, if the criminal was of noble blood, they were granted mercy blows, usually a final strike to the chest or head, offered after the bones were broken but before being threaded into the wheel. Because even in pulverization, hierarchy mattered. But the truly cruel innovation: in some regions, the wheel was rotated slowly during the breaking. That's right, you were spun. Not to dizzy you, but to evenly distribute the pain, allowing the crowd a panoramic view of your suffering, a literal turning point in medieval sadism. And no, it wasn't just for men. Women were also wheeled, especially those accused of infanticide, adultery, or poisoning. They were dressed modestly beforehand, of course, because public decency must be preserved while we smash your bones to pulp in front of the town square. And let's not forget the audience, because the breaking wheel was the kind of show that drew crowds. Markets popped up nearby. songs were written about notorious executions. Even local priests would give sermons using the fresh corpse as a visual aid. Look what sin does to the body. Justice? Hardly. It was performance. A grotesque circus act with a human body as both clown and curtain. But perhaps most disturbingly, many victims didn't die immediately. Some survived for hours, some for days. There are documented cases of wheel victims singing hymns, praying aloud, or whispering to onlookers for water. One famous case from 18th century Prussia involved a man who endured 2 full days on the wheel before finally succumbing to exposure. His crime? Stealing 3 sheep. So, next time you hear someone say they should bring back old-school justice, you might want to hand them a diagram of the breaking wheel and ask, how fast do you want the spin? If medieval Europe had a favorite color, it wasn't royal purple or divine gold. It was orange, the color of fire, not warm hearth fire or romantic candlelight, but the furious flame of execution. Because when all else failed, when bones had been broken, truths had been confessed, and sins had been shouted from the rack, there was always the stake. Burning someone alive wasn't invented in the Middle Ages, but oh, did the Europeans refine it? They gave it choreography, they gave it costumes, they gave it meaning. Because in the minds of kings and clergy alike, fire wasn't just a method of death, it was a cleansing force, purging the wicked from the world and sending their souls, or what was left of them, to judgment. Fully pre-charred. Let's talk logistics. A stake, tall and sturdy, planted in the center of a square. The condemned person, usually a heretic, witch, or blasphemer, was tied to it, arms bound behind the back, sometimes with chains, sometimes with ropes. Around the base, a carefully constructed pyre, made of dry wood, bundles of hay, or even pitch, soaked brush for extra flair. Firewood selection, by the way, was often a civic duty. The local baker, butcher, or teacher might donate logs, because justice is a community project. Executioners, ironically, didn't like fire. It was unpredictable. Sometimes it took too long. Sometimes it worked too fast. Sometimes the wind ruined everything. So they learned tricks. Soaking the victim's clothes in water to prolong the burn, or using tar-soaked rags to speed it up. And if the burning was for a VIP, say, Joan of Arc, they built a double pyre, just to be sure. The fire would be lit, slowly at first. Smoke would rise. The crowd would cheer, gasp, or weep, depending on their relationship with the soon-to-be charcoal. And then came the sound. Not screams, not yet, but crackling. The snap of twigs echoing against the stone walls, mixing with the creak of the stake itself. When the flames reached the body, it wasn't instant death. Oh no, it was a layered horror. First, the heat blistered the skin. Then the clothes caught fire, often stuck to the flesh. The victim would twist, thrash, scream a vertical dance of agony. Hair vanished, eyelids burned away. The lips curled into something resembling a smile, though no one found it amusing. The hands bound behind or in front shriveled into black claws. Some executioners, out of mercy or boredom, placed gunpowder pouches around the victim's neck or waist. When the fire reached them, they'd explode, hopefully killing the person quickly. But not always. Sometimes the gunpowder blew off a limb, and the rest kept burning. One observer in the 1600s described a witch burning where the woman's torso continued screaming after the legs were gone. Others preferred smoke to do the job. A tightly packed pyre produced thick smoke before flames enough to choke the lungs before the skin truly sizzled. If done right, the victim suffocated before becoming a human candle. If done wrong, well, the audience got a longer show. But the real horror of burning at the stake wasn't just the physical suffering, it was the moral spectacle. These weren't private executions, they were public theater. Invitations were unofficial but widespread. Children were brought. Vendors sold snacks. Priests gave sermons during the smoke. Sometimes executions were scheduled after Mass, so you could confess your sins, take communion, and then go watch someone combust. It was entertainment with a soul-cleansing side dish. And let's not forget gendered brutality. While men were burned for heresy or treason, women were more often burned for witchcraft, and the reasons were laughably broad. A woman healed someone with herbs, Witch, spoke out against a priest. Witch, had a mole in the wrong place. Triple witch. The logic was circular. If she denied being a witch, it proved she was lying. If she confessed, she obviously was. Either way, matches ready. Joan of Arc's burning was one of the most infamous. Tied to a stake in 1431, she was burned in 3 separate stages because the first fire didn't fully consume her body. After the first, the crowd saw her charred remains. After the second, her organs. After the third, she was ash. Her bones were collected and thrown into the Seine to prevent relic collecting, because what's worse than burning a woman? Letting people remember her. Fire was final. There were no survivors, no return, no body to bury. It was both execution and erasure. And for a church or crown that feared rebellion, that was perfect. So the next time you light a cozy fire, roast a marshmallow, or smell burning wood, maybe offer a quick thought for the thousands whose last scent was the same, only far less sweet. By now, you've read about bones being broken, flesh being flayed, and bodies being torched like heretical bonfires. But not all punishments were about blood and death. Sometimes, the worst agony was being left alive and publicly laughed at. Because let's be clear, medieval Europe was obsessed not just with punishing the guilty, but with making sure everyone saw it. Pain was physical, yes, but humiliation was spiritual. And nothing stuck in a villager's mind like seeing their neighbor dressed in a pig costume, rolling in dung, and being whipped by a singing priest. Let's begin with the pillory, a device more famous than feared, until you were the one in it. 2 wooden boards, holes for the head and hands, and an open square to serve as your stage. You weren't just stuck there for hours, you were exposed to rotten vegetables, urine, feces, and every insult a creative drunk could imagine. People took turns, children were encouraged to spit. Old women made up rhymes. Sometimes you had to stand in the pillory for entire market days, which meant you'd hear every "your mother was a goat" joke from sunrise to sunset. But worse than the pillory was the cucking stool, reserved mainly for women, especially those accused of gossiping, nagging, or being too loud in church. The accused was tied to a wooden seat attached to a long lever and dunked repeatedly into freezing rivers or sewage-filled moats. The idea wasn't to drown you, though, oops, sometimes it happened, but to cleanse your mouth physically and symbolically. One woman in 14th century England was dunked 17 times in a row before passing out. Her crime? Complaining that her husband brought home another woman. Let's not forget the shame masks. These were iron contraptions that made the Saw movies look like dental hygiene ads. Each mask was designed to mock the crime: a pig snout for gluttony, a tongue spike for lying, exaggerated ears for eavesdropping. The worst part? Many of them had bells attached, so you jingled with every step, announcing your disgrace like a walking punchline. Then there was public shaving, not as innocent as it sounds. For men, it meant beards were forcibly removed, often with dull blades and no water. In certain cultures, this was the ultimate emasculation. For women, hair was shorn bald, sometimes burned off, followed by forced parading through the village, wearing nothing but a placard reading, "I tempted men." The crowd was told to leer, jeer, and remember. After all, what good is punishment if no one learns from it? But perhaps the most surreal of all was the mock trial's actual public plays, where the accused was made to reenact their crime in front of the village, using props and puppets, before receiving their punishment. Imagine being forced to pretend to steal a chicken, then watch as someone in a rooster costume chases you across the square, while the town magistrate narrates your sins in rhyming verse. It sounds funny unless you're the one on your knees, clucking for mercy. What tied all these punishments together wasn't pain, it was memory. These acts were meant to stick in the minds of everyone watching. A broken leg healed. But the image of your neighbor in a jester hat, covered in tar and goose feathers, trying not to cry in front of their children, that stayed forever. In the medieval justice system, pain was fleeting, but disgrace was permanent. And often, that was the point. If you couldn't be executed, you'd be made into a living moral fable, a cautionary tale that walked, talked, and occasionally jingled like a fool on market day. When most people think of medieval torture, Their minds picture rotting castles, blood-stained dungeons, and iron spikes dripping with horror. But much of Europe's most refined cruelty didn't begin in a war chamber or a king's court. It began in a place with stained glass, candlelight, and hymns echoing off stone, the church. Yes, the Holy Church, the house of God, the center of salvation, and, as it turned out, the most prolific workshop for torture Europe had ever known. It all started with the idea that sin had to be confessed, but confession, according to the Inquisition, wasn't just a private spiritual act. It was a legal necessity, especially when the soul was suspected of heresy, that is, thinking differently from the official church doctrine. And if a confession didn't come freely, well, the body could be persuaded. Enter the Inquisitor, not a snarling executioner with blood on his axe, but a calm, educated man with a robe, a crucifix, and a parchment full of instruments of truth. His job wasn't to kill you, oh no, that would be too merciful. His job was to help you save your soul, even if your body had to scream for it. Inquisitorial torture chambers were paradoxes in stone. Beneath chapels of peace and mercy, hidden behind sanctuaries of forgiveness, lay dungeons filled with shackles, weights, spikes, and fire. These rooms were often soundproofed, so the moans wouldn't disturb prayer upstairs. They were clean, methodical, and terrifyingly efficient. The preferred tools of salvation. Let's start with the strappato. It sounded like pasta, but felt like hell. You were hoisted into the air by your wrists, which were tied behind your back. Then, the rope was suddenly released, dropping you violently before being yanked taut again, dislocating your shoulders, sometimes both at once. The beauty, if one can call it that, was that it left no external wounds, just internal screaming and lifelong maiming. Then came the rack, a timeless classic. Lay flat on a wooden board, have your ankles and wrists tied to rollers at either end, and start cranking. Inch by inch, your joints stretched, your tendons snapped, your muscles tore like overcooked meat. The goal wasn't to kill, it was to loosen your tongue. And if the rack didn't work, there was always the iron boot, into which your legs were placed and crushed slowly with wedges hammered between the wood and your flesh. Don't forget the heretic's fork, a metal rod with prongs at both ends, one pointing up under the chin, the other down into the sternum. Not sharp enough to kill, but just right to prevent any head movement at all. You couldn't sleep, couldn't look down, couldn't nod. The device whispered, "Think the wrong thoughts again, and you'll bleed trying to pray." And then there was the pair's sweet name, monstrous function. It was a metal device inserted into the mouth, anus, or vagina, depending on the crime. Once inside, it was expanded using a screw mechanism, tearing the soft tissue from the inside. Its purpose wasn't just to punish it, was to violate, to desecrate, to make the very act of speech, sex, or existence into a memory of agony. The Inquisition didn't just torture for punishment, it tortured for truth, and truth, by their standards, could only be one thing: total submission. Recant your beliefs. Name your fellow heretics. Confess to kissing the devil's foot, and if you don't, back to the chains, the fire, the water, the metal. Speaking of water, the ordeal by water was a divine test. Accused heretics were bound and lowered into a pool. If they floated, they were guilty, the water rejected them. If they sank, they were innocent, but often drowned anyway. God, it seems, had a cruel sense of balance. Perhaps the darkest irony was that many victims believed in the church. They weren't rebels or witches or satanic cultists. They were often ordinary people who asked the wrong question, quoted the wrong passage, or simply spoke Latin too fluently. Suspicion alone could land you in an inquisitor's ledger, and once you were in, you didn't come out clean. No one expected mercy, because the worst part of these punishments wasn't the pain, it was that they were framed as acts of love. "We're saving you," they said. This isn't vengeance, it's redemption. They prayed before they tortured. They lit candles before they branded. They chanted psalms while you screamed. In that sense, the church didn't just create torture chambers, it sacralized them. It painted blood on the cross and called it holy. It turned agony into sacrament. And in doing so, it wrote one of the most terrifying chapters in the history of punishment, where God watched and no one dared look away. If the Inquisition was the hand of God, then women were often its preferred target, because in medieval Europe, being female wasn't just a demographic, it was a spiritual liability. A woman who read too much? Dangerous. A woman who didn't marry? Suspicious. A woman who knew the names of too many herbs? Definitely a witch. And nothing screams theological terror like the witch hunts that swept through Europe like wildfires in the name of purity. It didn't matter if you were poor, widowed, eccentric, or just had a birthmark in the wrong place. Someone would eventually say you rode a goat to meet Satan, and that was enough. Let's start with the basics. Witches didn't have to exist for people to burn them. The fear of heresy combined with misogyny created the perfect storm, and the church's dogma added kerosene. Church texts warned that women were weaker in faith, stronger in lust, and therefore more vulnerable to temptation. Inquisitors cited Augustine and Aquinas to justify why Eve was to blame for Adam's fall, and thus every woman after her might be hiding a serpent in her heart. The punishments? They were tailored not just to cause pain, but to strip identity and femininity. For instance, during witch trials, women were stripped naked in public before interrogation. To check for the devil's mark, they said, but everyone knew it was about humiliation. Next came the tools. One of the most infamous was the breast ripper, a claw-like metal device heated until red hot, then used to literally tear off a woman's breasts. Another was the iron spider, a similar device mounted on walls, where a woman was dragged forward into its hooks. These were used not only as punishment but as symbolic destruction of female sin. And if torture didn't get a confession, no problem, because in many towns, a woman's silence was also evidence of guilt. If she screamed, she was lying. If she cried, she was playing the victim. If she said nothing, the devil had sealed her lips. Then there were the infamous witch trials by ordeal. One favorite was the needle test. Professional prickers would stab women all over, looking for numb spots where the devil's pact had made them immune to pain. Another was the swimming test, where the accused would be bound and thrown into a river. Float? You're guilty. Sink? Oops, sorry, innocent, but dead. The entire process was a theater of confession, staged for the public, reinforced by the church, and aimed not just at punishing individuals, but terrorizing communities into obedience. Every burned woman was a message: stay quiet, stay ordinary, stay fearful. Sometimes the victims weren't even adults. Girls as young as 12 were accused because they had visions or talked to birds. In one French town, a 14-year-old was burned alive because she claimed to hear the voice of the Virgin Mary and didn't deny it under questioning. The irony? If a man had said the same, he might have been canonized. And what made all this worse was that these horrors weren't committed by lone madmen, but by entire communities, under religious sanction. Priests blessed the stakes. Choir boys sang hymns as flames climbed women's legs. Townspeople brought their children to watch, to learn, to believe. Because that's what the church understood so well. Torture wasn't just for the body, it was for the soul and for the audience. Punishment had to be visible, moralized, and eternal. So when we talk about the witch hunts, let's be honest, they weren't about demons or darkness or diabolism. They were about control of knowledge, of behavior, of women. And pain was just the loudest sermon. If dungeons were for confession, then the town square was for spectacle, because once the inquisitors had wrung out a confession, whether by persuasion or by pliers, the next step wasn't private absolution. No, it was public purification. They called it an auto da fe, an act of faith, but what it really meant was a pageant of pain. In cities across Europe, particularly in Spain and Portugal, these ceremonies turned executions into ritualized events, complete with choirs, processions, and priests reciting scripture over the condemned. Imagine this: a wooden stage in the center of the square, hundreds of townsfolk gathered, wearing their Sunday best, vendors selling bread and wine, parents lifting children onto their shoulders for a better view. And in the middle, the accused, shackled and shamed, wearing the Sanbenito, a tunic painted with flames and devils, sometimes with their names and alleged sins embroidered across the chest. It was not just death, it was theater. And like any good show, it had music. Hymns floated through the air as the clergy led the march. The bishop blessed the executioners. And in some cases, sermons were delivered between burnings, as if to say, "Here is your lesson, here is your proof, here is God's justice." The condemned were often gagged not to silence blasphemy, but to prevent last-minute truths. If someone screamed, "I was innocent," that could disrupt the narrative. Silence, after all, was part of the choreography. And then came the fire. Not a quick guillotine, not even a hanging, but slow, smoking, skin-cracking flame. Sometimes they used wet wood to prolong the agony. Sometimes they tied the victim with wire instead of rope, so the body wouldn't fall forward too soon. The goal wasn't just to kill, it was to burn in a way that said, this soul was purified through pain. For the crowd, it was catharsis, a moral cleansing, a reminder of what happened when doubt whispered too loud. And for the church, it was power. Because every scream, every ash, every tear was a renewal of authority, a live-action sermon written in blood. But the most haunting part? People cheered. They didn't just watch, they participated. Children threw pebbles. Elders crossed themselves as flames roared. Some people wept, but not for the burning. They wept for the glory of God's justice. It was a holy day, and pain was the incense. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, consider this. Many of those burned weren't even executed by the church itself. The church would reluctantly hand them over to the secular authorities, a legal loophole that allowed clerics to say, "We don't shed blood." No, they just tied your hands and passed you to someone who did. Some executions weren't even based on action, but intention. You could be burned not for what you did, but for what they said you meant to do. A Jewish man accused of secretly practicing his faith. A Muslim who didn't eat pork. A scholar who translated the wrong scripture. All sentenced with the same prayer, "May God have mercy on your soul." But let's be clear, this wasn't just about religion. It was about social order. Public punishment taught people their place, that obedience meant safety, and questioning meant flame. That God's love was warm, but his wrath was blistering. And if you think that ended in the Middle Ages, well, no. The last official auto da fe occurred as late as 1826 in Spain. That's right. In an era with trains, revolutions, and newspapers, people were still being burned alive because a priest said so. Because the flames weren't just physical, they were philosophical, a way to cauterize doubt, cauterize rebellion, cauterize the terrifying idea that someone could believe differently and still deserve to live. So the fire wasn't just a tool, it was a message. And that message was, "We are the light, you are the kindling." Perhaps the most perverse feature of church-administered punishment wasn't the brutality itself, but the way it was rationalized. These weren't monsters doing monstrous things. They were men of God, cloaked in cassocks, whispering prayers as they broke bones, convinced, utterly and deeply, that they were saving souls. You see, for the Inquisition and its spiritual machinery, torture was a sacrament. It wasn't just about extracting information or enforcing obedience. It was framed as a sacred process of purification. Just as fire refines gold, pain, they believed, refined the soul. The logic was breathtakingly cruel. If you were tortured and confessed, you were guilty but redeemable. If you were tortured and didn't confess, you were stubborn and the devil had you. Either way, you burned, but one fire was seen as punishment, the other as penance. In some Inquisition manuals, inquisitors were instructed to treat their victims with compassion. That meant ensuring they didn't die too early during torture, because dying before confession meant dying in sin. So they'd loosen the thumbscrews, let you breathe, then start again, not out of malice, but out of divine duty. There were even ceremonies to accompany certain tortures. Before applying the rack, a priest might say a prayer. After tearing a woman's confession from her with a heated iron, a monk might offer her water and a chance to pray. God loves the broken, they'd say. They just forgot to mention they were the ones breaking you. In some cases, victims were made to thank their torturers. A whispered "Deo gratias" before execution wasn't just ritual, it was demanded. Because if you went to the flames cursing the church, your death was politically inconvenient. But if you went to the flames smiling, grateful, then the crowd saw justice. They saw harmony. They saw the church win. Even the language twisted itself into knots of piety. Torture wasn't called torment, it was called the question. Executions weren't murders, they were acts of cleansing. Victims weren't mutilated, they were guided toward repentance. And it worked, not because it was true, but because it was repeated. Generation after generation, townspeople watched their priests bless the gallows and their neighbors cheer the flames. They grew up believing that agony was necessary, and that sometimes a good soul needed to be broken before it could be saved. What made it even more chilling was the fact that many inquisitors believed their own justifications. They wept for the condemned. They prayed sincerely. Some even claimed to have dreams in which God reassured them, "This is right." That's how deep the illusion ran. The torturers weren't always hypocrites. Sometimes they were true believers. And that's perhaps the most dangerous thing about institutional cruelty wrapped in divinity. It doesn't recognize itself as cruelty. It walks in daylight. It sings hymns. It smiles kindly as it tightens the rope. Because when pain is prescribed by holy men, it becomes medicine. And when medicine is fire, your scream is just a symptom. Long before bureaucrats in powdered wigs ruled over courtrooms and codes of law, kings ruled with clubs, whips, and public fear. In medieval and early modern Europe, justice wasn't just about fairness, it was about spectacle. And if religion claimed your soul, the crown claimed your flesh. Take Louis XI of France, affectionately nicknamed the Universal Spider for his intricate web of informants and paranoia. He didn't just jail his enemies, he caged them, literally. Louis commissioned iron cages, narrow, coffin-like boxes where prisoners couldn't stand, sit, or lie flat. Some men spent years inside, slowly withering into bone and regret. Or consider Vlad III of Wallachia, better known as Vlad the Impaler. His favorite pastime wasn't feasting or jousting, but impaling people through the rectum and letting them die slowly over days. He impaled entire villages, rebels, criminals, beggars, even diplomats. One German envoy offended Vlad by not removing his hat, so Vlad nailed it to his skull. Was it justice? No, it was terror as performance. Because for monarchs like Vlad, cruelty wasn't a means to an end, it was the end. The more gruesome the punishment, the louder the message. This is my land. You live at my mercy. I am the law. And it worked. Tales of Vlad's atrocities spread across Europe like a plague, but instead of turning people against him, they made him a legend. His enemies feared him, his subjects obeyed him. And his throne stayed bloody, but unshaken. Across the continent, kings and nobles took notes. Charles V of Spain had prisoners' slowly garroted necks crushed by iron collars tightened inch by inch. In Tudor England, traitors were drawn and quartered, hanged until half dead, disemboweled alive, their genitals burned before their eyes, and finally, their limbs nailed to city gates like political graffiti. Even so-called minor offenses weren't spared. In medieval Germany, stealing a loaf of bread might get you branded on the face with a hot iron, so every village knew what you were. In France, women accused of prostitution could have their noses cut off because apparently shame needed to be visible. Kings didn't hide their punishments behind courtroom doors. They built gallows in market squares, execution platforms in front of palaces, and stocks at every church entrance. The message was clear: obey, or be the next show. And the people? They came to watch. Not because they enjoyed the blood, though some surely did, but because they were taught to. Attendance was mandatory in many towns. Parents brought children. Schools paused lessons. Clerics gave sermons before the axe fell. It was civic theater. A national ritual. A rehearsal of obedience. So while priests burned you for heresy, kings flayed you for disrespect. While bishops prayed for your soul, monarchs paraded your corpse. And somewhere between the gallows and the gold-embroidered throne, justice became another word for obedience. As monarchies matured and centralized their power, they began wrapping punishment in parchment and poetry. Gone were the days of arbitrary beatings in the town square now. Your destruction came with documents, signatures, and a deeply ironic sense of decorum. Consider France's Code Noir, issued under Louis XIV. On paper, it was a legal document, a statute, a royal edict. In practice, it was a manual for managing human property, detailing how to discipline enslaved people, down to the approved methods and frequencies. It didn't just permit brutality, it prescribed it. It read like a textbook. Slaves may be beaten, but not mutilated unless caught attempting escape. Branding is permissible, especially for repeat offenses. Children born to enslaved mothers are also slaves. It was neat, organized, elegant in its bureaucratic horror. Meanwhile, in England, legal terminology wrapped pain in Baroque verbosity. Instead of saying, "cut off his hand," court records might say, "let the member which offended be removed, such that he may serve as example to others, and the body be chastised in its guilt." Sounds beautiful until you realize it means a blacksmith got his fingers chopped off for crafting illegal horseshoes. And then there was the bloody code, a term historians later gave to the over 200 capital offenses punishable by death in 18th century England. Among them, stealing a handkerchief, cutting down a young tree, being found on a public road with a blackened face, interpreted as intent to rob. What made it worse wasn't just the punishments, but how ordinarily they were delivered. A pickpocket might be hanged on a Sunday morning, between church bells and aftermarket chatter. The townsfolk didn't scream, they yawned. Terror had been normalized. It was woven into the rhythm of public life. In these systems, the language wasn't just a veil, it was a performance. Lawyers and judges became actors in a ritualized ballet, reciting Latin incantations while children clutched their mothers' skirts and convicts wept beneath the noose. And if you ever read the sentencing records, oh, how carefully they're worded. The court, having considered the evidence and weighing the nature of the crime, hereby decrees that the accused shall be led to the place of execution, and there, by the neck, be hanged until death ensue, and his body remain for the instruction of the public. Instruction of the public. Education through decay. This wasn't just justice, it was moral theater. Every citizen, magistrate, and monarch played a role in the stagecraft of cruelty, and the script was always the same. You broke the peace and now your body will teach it. Even executioners followed scripts. In France, the headsman was a public servant, a taxpayer-funded artisan of death. He practiced his blade like a violinist tunes his instrument. In England, the hangman had a formal job title and pension. Death was a job. And justice? It was a job well done when the crowd went silent and no one remembered the criminal's name. Imagine a town square at sunrise, cobbled stones damp with dew, crows picking at yesterday's market scraps, and a wooden platform in the center, freshly scrubbed for the day's entertainment. Because that's exactly what these punishments were: scheduled events, announced by criers and attended like festivals. No royal decree or holy sermon could match the drawing power of a hanging. In 17th century London, executions at Tyburn Tree were social gatherings. Vendors sold hot meat pies and cheap ale. Entire families arrived early to stake out spots for the best view. Some even brought folding stools. Children sat on their father's shoulders. Couples held hands. Death was a picnic. And it wasn't just London. In Amsterdam, convicts sentenced to the rack were marched through the streets while crowds jeered, cheered, and spat. In Paris, Guillotine Day was appointment viewing, taverns emptied, windows filled, and pamphlets described the condemned's final words in lurid detail. It was, quite literally, death by popular demand. There was even a word for it: exemplary punishment. Meaning, not just punishment, but punishment with an audience. The logic? If the public sees your suffering, they'll be scared into obedience. But in practice, the reverse often happened. These displays turned into morality theater, complete with heroes and villains, and, like all theater, some actors stole the show. One famous English highwayman, Jack Sheppard, escaped prison 4 times before his final execution in 1724. By then, he was a folk legend. On the day of his hanging, Over 200 people gathered to watch. Women wept, men shouted oaths of vengeance, street hawkers sold his portrait. And when the rope snapped his neck, the crowd booed. He wasn't the only one. Some condemned prisoners prepared monologues. Others rehearsed prayers with rhythmic cadence, hoping to go down remembered. And the crowd, oh, the crowd, they judged every nuance. Was she brave? Was he defiant? Did he cry too early? Punishment had become performance, and every performance needed a good audience. The problem? Crowds sometimes turned. In Naples, a bungled beheading once enraged onlookers so deeply they rushed the scaffold and beat the executioner to death. In Scotland, public dismemberment sometimes ended in riots when the crowd felt the punishment was unjust or too boring. Yes, too boring. If the spectacle wasn't satisfying, it failed its purpose. Because violence in public hands has its own currency, emotion. And so, justice became a paradox. The more public the punishment, the more it risked becoming popularized. The more blood spilled for obedience, the more citizens tasted resistance. The state tried to terrify its people, and in doing so, taught them how to feel powerful through pain. In time, rulers began to worry, were these events deterrents or rallies? Was the scaffold a symbol of fear or fame? And when you can't tell if the crowd is mourning or cheering, you've already lost control of the show. By the 18th century, a strange contradiction had settled over Europe. Nations that prided themselves on Enlightenment ideals also developed some of the most coldly efficient methods of state-sponsored violence. Enter the guillotine. Its inventor, Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin, proposed it not as an instrument of terror, but as a humane alternative. His logic, beheading by sword or axe, was imprecise, prone to multiple strikes, and humiliating. Why not build a device that killed instantly, every time, with equal treatment for rich and poor? Thus was born a machine that democratized death and mass-produced it. The guillotine was a marvel of design. A heavy angled blade ensured a clean cut. A lunette holding device stabilized the victim's neck. A simple pulley system allowed quick resets between executions. It was mechanical, impartial, and brutally reliable. So reliable, in fact, that during the French Revolution's reign of terror, it processed as many as 30 heads a day. Some weeks, it worked in shifts. Spectators gave it nicknames: the Widow, the National Razor, Madame Guillotine. Children sang rhymes about it. Lovers met beneath its scaffold. One Parisian woman wrote in her diary, "We admire its grace, how cleanly it does what men botch with swords." But France was not alone in mechanizing pain. In Spain, engineers designed the garrote, a steel collar tightened by a screw crank, crushing the throat and spine. In Germany, the breaking wheel was refined with metal pins to guide fractures along optimal points. In England, hanging techniques evolved from slow strangulation to the long drop method, which snapped the neck instantly. These were acts of precision, calculated, timed. Some executioners even studied anatomy. One boasted, "I can sever a head clean in one stroke. You must know where to aim like butchers do." The idea wasn't just to kill, it was to kill better. There were manuals, diagrams, measurements for optimal drop distance based on weight. A man weighing 160 pounds, 6 feet of rope. A woman of 120, 5.5. Justice had become a math problem. And behind that math was a deeply unsettling truth. When murder becomes efficient, it also becomes invisible. No more writhing, no more screaming, just a thud, a blade, a silence. People stopped flinching, the state stopped apologizing, and death, now so neat, so fast, felt less like a tragedy and more like a procedure. But precision is not the same as morality. A clean death does not mean a just one. And perhaps the guillotine's greatest cruelty wasn't its blade, but the comfort it gave those who used it. Because when justice is delivered by machine, it's easy to forget who turned the crank. Why were so many resources, time, money, manpower, dedicated to punishing people in the most horrific ways imaginable? Not just killing. Hurt. Humiliation. Prolonged agony. Why create a machine that draws your limbs in opposite directions for hours before you die? Why train a man to boil another alive and then write down his screams? The answer lies not in the law books, but in something older. The human craving for moral order. Not fairness. Not balance. But punishment. In ancient and medieval minds, pain was proof. If someone suffered, they must have deserved it. If justice felt satisfying, it must have been righteous. If the guilty screamed, the world felt safer. Pain gave meaning to punishment, and punishment gave reassurance to the people. Even when rulers claimed it was about law, the real motivation was control not just of bodies, but of fear itself. If people feared the rack, the wheel, or the stake more than they hated your taxes or your power, then you'd won. And for the public? Witnessing punishment wasn't just entertaining, it was cathartic. It allowed you to project your own frustrations onto the condemned. You could shout, spit, gasp, or pray and walk away feeling cleaner. Because deep down, punishment made society feel moral. That man who was disemboweled, he deserved it. That woman whose tongue was cut out, she must have lied. We needed their pain to prove that the world still had rules, even when those rules were cruel. But there's something else, something darker. We remembered these punishments. We passed them down. We carved them into wood. We painted them on ceilings. We wrote poems and sang songs. We didn't just punish people. We immortalized their punishment. Because, in a strange, shameful way, we loved the drama. It made our gods look just. It made our kings look strong. It made us feel safer. And that is perhaps the most brutal punishment of all. To live in a world where pain feels like justice, and silence after the screaming stops feels like peace. If medieval punishment was theater, then women were often cast in the role of villain or sacrifice. While male criminals were usually judged for their actions, women were frequently punished for who they were or what they represented. A woman who didn't marry? Suspicious. One who spoke too freely? Dangerous. One who bled monthly and gave birth? Possibly cursed. In many corners of medieval Europe, a woman's womb wasn't seen as miraculous. It was seen as chaotic, unpredictable, and inherently untrustworthy. And where fear blooms, violence often follows. Enter the witch trials. Though popular imagination places these trials in Puritan New England, Europe led the way centuries earlier. Between the 1400s and 1700s, an estimated 0 to 60 people were executed as witches. Over 80% were women. Their crimes? Owning too many cats, living alone, helping with childbirths, brewing herbs for cramps. And their punishments? Burning, of course, fire being the church's way of purifying souls. But also, the swimming test, where suspected witches were thrown into rivers. If they sank, they were innocent but drowned, and if they floated, guilty and executed. The witch's bridle, a spiked iron muzzle that pierced the tongue and cheeks, silencing speech permanently. Shaving of the head and public stripping, followed by interrogation that often became sexual violence in disguise. Many were tortured into confessing absurd things. Flying at night, mating with demons, spoiling crops with their gaze. And once a woman was accused, no defense worked. If she was calm, she had no remorse. If she cried, it was manipulation. If she denied everything, that was proof she had bewitched the judges. It was a damned if you do, damned if you don't spiral of fear, misogyny, and community paranoia. But witches were only one side of the coin. Even respectable women weren't spared, especially when they failed to meet male expectations. A woman who argued with her husband too much could be put in a scold's bridle, a metal cage fitted over her head with a tongue-pressing plate, worn in the town square. She would stand for hours, unable to speak, drooling, humiliated, while children threw garbage at her feet. Another punishment was ducking, a method where mouthy women were repeatedly dunked in freezing rivers. The more she screamed, the more the villagers clapped. The lesson was clear. To speak was to sin. To resist was to die. To survive, you had to disappear. And in many villages, women did just that, not through exile, but through silence. Generations grew up watching their mothers and aunts punished not for what they did, but for simply being seen. In the harsh logic of medieval justice, childhood wasn't a shield. It wasn't even a concept. There were no juvenile courts, no allowances for immaturity, no belief in emotional development. You could be punished severely at age 7, sometimes younger. And the punishments? A boy who stole bread could be branded on the forehead with a hot iron. A girl who disobeyed her master might have her fingers crushed in a clamp to teach obedience. Children accused of lying or dishonoring elders were whipped publicly, their cries adding to the chorus of market-day cruelty. Sometimes the crimes weren't even crimes. In 14th century France, a 3-year-old was executed for blasphemy. His crime? Repeating a phrase his father had said during a drunken outburst. The church deemed it heresy. The punishment? A hanging in full public view. In England, a boy of 10 was placed in the stocks for failing to bow to a priest. His legs went numb. He lost sensation for life. And in many towns, children were beaten for the sins of their parents. If a mother was convicted of theft, her children might be whipped in her place as a symbol that sin begets sin. If a father owed taxes, his sons could be put to forced labor. Some punishments were disguised as moral education. A disobedient daughter might be made to wear a wooden collar carved with the words slut or witch, even if she had done nothing worse than sneak out after dark. She would be paraded in school and in church, as her peers instructed by adults chanted lessons about virtue. And there were no exceptions for orphans. If a child had no guardian, the state became both parent and punisher. In German orphanages of the 1600s, discipline rooms were common. Children as young as 5 were locked in dark closets for hours. Some were made to kneel on dried peas until their knees bled. Others were forced to write lines for hours with their hands tied to a block to ensure neatness. In these systems, pain wasn't the price of justice. It was the method of teaching. And trauma wasn't an unfortunate side effect. It was seen as proof that the lesson had sunk in. Modern eyes might ask, how could people do this to children? But the answer lies in how they saw childhood itself. To many medieval minds, children weren't innocent. They were tiny sinners, born into original sin, just as corruptible and wicked as adults, perhaps more so. So the sooner you crushed their will, the sooner you shaped their soul. And what did that create? Generations of adults raised not by nurture, but by terror. Adults who'd go on to repeat the same punishments. Not because they were evil, but because they couldn't imagine love without violence. In medieval Europe, to be born different was to be marked not just by nature, but by society's fear. There were no diagnoses, no empathy, no understanding of mental health or physical variation. There was only one lens: sin. A man with a limp, cursed. A woman who heard voices, possessed. A child born with a deformity, a punishment from God, or worse, a sign of witchcraft. So what did society do with these monsters? It punished them. Sometimes openly, sometimes behind locked doors, but always with cruelty disguised as correction. Those with mental illness were often jailed, not treated. Inmates at Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, the infamous Bedlam, were tied to walls and left to scream for hours. Visitors paid admission fees to watch them. Yes, they were entertainment. You could bring your family, tour the asylum, laugh at the mad ones, and leave feeling better about your own sanity. Others were cured with violence. Forced exorcisms, ice water baths, bleeding with leeches, tying to spinning chairs for hours to realign the humors. And if those didn't work, then the fault lay in the soul. The church sometimes authorized floggings to drive out the demon. If someone resisted, it only proved the devil was strong. For those with physical disabilities, life was just as brutal. There were no ramps, no protection, no jobs. A man missing a leg might be branded a beggar, even if he was once a soldier. A woman born blind could be accused of being a seer and accused of leading others astray with her visions. In some cities, cripples were banned from marketplaces so as not to offend customers. In others, they were taxed for existing a cripple's fee to walk the streets. And yet, if they asked for food, they could be beaten for begging. It was a closed loop. You can't work. You can't beg. You can't stay. What remains especially chilling is how systematic this cruelty became. Some towns forced disabled individuals to wear bells so others could hear them coming. The bells weren't for help, they were warnings. Something wrong this way comes. Even the language of the time was designed to erase humanity. They weren't people with conditions. They were fools, monsters, beasts. Church sermons described them as tests of the faithful or reminders of what sin could do to a body. And so, those already born into struggle were condemned twice. First, by fate. Then, by their neighbors. Worst of all, many believe they deserved it. When the only mirror you have is a cruel crowd, eventually, you believe what they reflect. In the medieval world, if you weren't from here, then you probably didn't belong. And if you didn't belong, your pain didn't count. Across Europe, being an outsider in race, in faith, or in language meant that justice wasn't blind. It was staring right at you. Slavery wasn't hidden. It wasn't questioned. It wasn't even considered cruel. It was normal. Especially if you were a foreigner. Captured in war? Taken in raids? Born in the wrong place? Congratulations, you were now property. In places like Portugal, Spain, and parts of Italy, African slaves were branded with hot irons, not just once, but every time they were sold. These brands weren't hidden. They were worn on faces, chests, or palms as permanent proof of ownership. If a slave tried to escape, they could be whipped until unconscious, have their Achilles tendon slit, or be forced to wear a spiked iron collar that tore the skin every time they moved. Some were blinded. Some had ears cut off. Some were simply tied to carts and dragged through town as a lesson to others. And it wasn't just Africans. Roma people, often called gypsies, were branded as thieves and liars. Laws were written specifically to ban them from trades, confiscate their property, and beat them on sight. They were called vermin, parasites, and worse. A traveling Roma group might find their wagons burned, their children taken, and their elders hanged without trial. And the justification? They don't believe what we do. They don't speak our tongue. They don't look like us. The church gave its blessing to many of these policies. Inquisitors viewed Muslims, Jews, and pagans as either potential converts or enemies of Christ. And if you refused to convert, you might be forced to wear a yellow badge, a dunce cap, or a rope collar symbolizing your spiritual bondage. You could be fined, imprisoned, burned. The logic wasn't legal. It was theological. Pain purified. Conversion erased identity. And punishment brought souls closer to God even if it killed them. The most brutal punishments weren't about what someone did. They were about what someone was. Born black, you could be a slave. Born Roma, you were a thief by default. Born in a Muslim land, you were a heretic, even if you'd never prayed. Born into the wrong faith, your very breath was a rebellion. This wasn't justice. It was a script. And if you didn't play the role assigned to you, the system had ways of making you suffer until you did. If there's one thing that united the brutal punishments of medieval Europe, it wasn't just the violence. it was the careful selection of victims. Punishment, for all its spectacle, was rarely about crime. It was about control. And who better to control than those who couldn't fight back? The old, the young, the poor, the foreign, the female, the disabled. Each offered something precious to the system, obedience or a reason to be punished. Either way, they served the machine. A woman who disobeyed her husband could be humiliated in public, and it was called justice. A child who stole food could be beaten in the square, and it was called discipline. A beggar who asked for mercy could be lashed, and it was called law. These weren't outliers. They were designed features of a society where power fed on weakness, like a vampire in daylight. The legal system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as intended. Even when laws were passed to protect, they came with thorns. A law might limit how a man could strike his wife but not ban it. Another might ban child labor and still allow boys to be hanged. One city might outlaw public torture while building underground chambers to continue it in secret. Because it was never really about protection. It was about performance. Public morality had to be shown. Sin had to be punished visibly. And virtue had to be purchased with pain. That's why so many punishments were theatrical. Iron masks, shame carts, caged displays, burning effigies. The public had to see that someone was suffering so they wouldn't step out of line themselves. And the best part? The victims couldn't stop it. Couldn't afford lawyers. Couldn't write complaints. Couldn't escape. They were perfect victims because they were trapped not just by circumstance, but by belief. They believed they deserved it. Others believed they deserved it. The church confirmed it. The town cheered it. And the system ran on it. So who got punished the most in medieval Europe? Not the powerful, not the rich, not the truly dangerous, but those who were. Visible enough to blame, quiet enough not to scream, and powerless enough to make it stick. In the end, the brutality of the punishment told you less about the crime, and everything about the society that allowed it. The executioner may be gone. The stocks dismantled. The Iron Maiden retired to museums. But the fingerprints of medieval punishment? They're everywhere. Start with the words. Ever been scapegoated? That term comes from the ancient ritual of placing sins onto a goat, then sending it into the wild, and medieval society loved the metaphor. They just replaced the goat with, well, usually a person. How about someone being pilloried in the media? That's not just a figure of speech. The pillory was a real device, 2 boards with holes for the head and arms. The person inside it couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't shield themselves. People would spit, throw rotten food, and laugh for hours. Sound familiar? The phrase, to break someone on the wheel. That's not poetic. It's literal. A torture method where someone's limbs were shattered with a large cartwheel, bone by bone, joint by joint. And if you ever said someone was put through the ringer, that comes from the rack, where victims were stretched until their joints dislocated and muscles tore. Even common idioms like, an eye for an eye. Make an example of them. Justice must be seen to be done. All trace their roots back to systems designed not for fairness, but fear. But it's not just words. It's behaviors, customs, instincts. Why are we fascinated by public shaming? Why do online mobs pile onto one person with meme stocks of outrage, often without trial, without context? Why do TV shows, tabloids, and Twitter trends so often resemble public executions, minus the acts? Because we never stopped watching. We just changed the stage. And some of the tools we use? Still medieval in spirit. Solitary confinement? Still exists. Often described by modern psychologists as psychological torture. Public registries for shame-based offenses? sound eerily close to permanent branding. Mass incarceration of the poor while the rich walk free. A new version of debtor's prison, just with better lighting. Even school punishments, dunce caps, standing in the corner, writing lines are descendants of medieval penance rituals, where humiliation was the medicine and silence the cure. The ghost of the gallows is gone, but it still whispers in our laws, echoes in our culture, and smiles through our cruelty. Let's play a quick game. I'll describe a punishment, and you tell me which century it's from. A person commits a petty offense. They are dragged before a judge. Their sentence is made public, not just to their neighbors, but to millions. They are humiliated, mocked, cursed at, doxxed. Sometimes their home is vandalized. Their face is turned into a meme. Their voice replaced with captions that twist everything they say. They lose their job, their family, their future. Now, was that medieval Europe? Or modern internet culture? Because honestly, does it matter? Punishment in the Middle Ages was public theater. You didn't just suffer, you suffered where others could see. That's why town squares were filled with gallows. Why churches were given front row seats to hangings. Why justice was loud, messy, and painfully slow. We've kept the formula. We just traded cobblestones for comment sections. Reality shows that humiliate contestants for being different. Tabloids that stalk celebrities and delight in their meltdowns. Viral videos of people getting what they deserve. They all follow the same three-act structure. 1. The crime, real or imagined. 2. The judgment, instant and emotional. 3. The punishment, endless, exaggerated, and entertaining. We binge this drama like medieval crowds watched executions. With snacks. With jokes. With zero consequences for ourselves. But let's not pretend we're the audience. Sometimes we're also the executioners. When we share the post. When we leave the mocking comment. When we dogpile on someone for 5 seconds of perceived stupidity. And worst of all, we convince ourselves it's righteous. They deserved it. They should have known better. They brought it on themselves. Sound familiar? That's exactly what villagers said when flogging a thief. What judges said when branding a woman. What neighbors said when stoning the outcast. The only difference now is that our whips are made of pixels. Our crowds are invisible. And our shame is global. The spectacle hasn't ended. It's just gone wireless. And that makes it more dangerous. Because at least in medieval times, you had to show up to a public execution. You had to look the condemned in the eye. You had to own your part in their suffering. Now, you can destroy a life with a click, then move on to lunch. In medieval times, justice often wore a hood. It didn't need to justify itself, only to be seen doing something. Today, the hood is gone. But the shadow? Still here. Because sometimes the most brutal punishment is not a sword, but paperwork. Take the legal system. Miss one payment on a fine? You could lose your driver's license. Lose your license? You can't work. Can't work? You miss court. Miss court? You get arrested. Suddenly, a 100 fine becomes jail time. And the judge? They're just following the rules. Sound familiar? Medieval punishments worked the same way. Steal a loaf of bread? Get a finger chopped off. Late with taxes? You're thrown into debtor's prison, no trial, no appeal. Back then, your poverty was a crime. Now, we just call it non-compliance. And then there's bail. In some places, you can rot in jail for weeks, not because you're guilty, but because you can't pay the price of your freedom. We even use the term pre-trial detention. Sounds harmless, right? But it can mean months in isolation, no conviction, no end in sight. It's the modern dungeon. Cold, bureaucratic, justified by law. In medieval cities, stocks punished the poor for being visible. Today, eviction notices, suspensions, and credit scores do the same. Can't afford a lawyer? That's your fault. Confused by the system? Learn faster. Lost everything before your appeal? That's how it works. Justice becomes a maze. The punishment? Trying to survive it. And while it's happening, no one calls it violence. They call it policy, regulation, standard operating procedure. But just because the torture is quiet doesn't mean it's not torture. We've replaced the iron cage with invisible ones. Systems you can't afford to fight. Loops you can't exit. Labels you can't shed. And, just like in the Middle Ages, the real sentence isn't the one in the courtroom. It's the lifetime of consequences that follows you home. Not every punishment needs blood. Some use silence. Some use expectation. And some use love as a weapon. Let's step out of the courtroom and into the living room. Imagine a child raised in fear of disappointing their parents. Not because they'll be beaten, but because love will be withdrawn. That's punishment. Just quieter. In medieval times, sin was corrected by public penance. You stood at the church steps in rags, begging forgiveness. Not for justice, but for acceptance. Modern version? You miss a family tradition. They stop inviting you. You speak your truth. They call it betrayal. You leave a religion. They call it a crisis. Punishment becomes social erasure. And then there's school, where silence is good behavior and obedience is excellence. Ever wonder why the gifted kid burns out? Or why someone who questions the rules is labeled a problem? Because the system rewards those who comply, not those who think. That's not education. That's training for submission. In workplaces, it's the same. Question the boss, you're not a team player. Ask for fair pay, you're difficult. Set boundaries, you're ungrateful. These aren't just attitudes. They're tools of correction. Even spirituality can become punishment. In some traditions, suffering is glorified. Hardship becomes proof of purity. To doubt, to rest, to ask becomes a sin. You're taught to smile while breaking. To thank your pain for making you better. That's not resilience. That's internalized control. The most effective punishments are the ones that don't feel like punishment. You don't see the shackles because they were woven from your beliefs. You follow rules not out of fear, but because you think you should. You stay silent not because someone hit you, but because they once called you disrespectful. You obey not because of consequence, but because love, belonging, and identity have been tied to obedience. This is emotional feudalism, a system where the lords are invisible, but the loyalty is real. And just like in the Middle Ages, there's no need for chains when guilt and shame do the job for free. You were probably hoping this story would end with relief. That after the blood and chains, the fires and floggings, we'd say, but thank goodness we've moved on. But have we? Yes, we don't put people on the rack anymore. We don't boil them in oil. We don't brand them in public squares. But we do destroy reputations in ours. We do economically starve those who step out of line. We do isolate, shame, silence, and exile. With precision. With speed. And worst of all, with approval. Because the medieval world wasn't about cruelty for fun. It was about order. About maintaining power. Making sure everyone knew their place. And punishing those who forgot. That hasn't changed. Only the language has. We now call punishment accountability, professional consequences, social correction, therapeutic boundaries, all of which can be valid. until they become execution in disguise. The stocks are now comment sections. The dungeons are legal loopholes. The brands are viral screenshots. The torches? Smartphones burning reputations in real time. We created the illusion of a kinder world by making the tools invisible. But that's the cruelest thing of all. Because when punishment is obvious, you can fight it. You can name it. You can say, this is wrong. But when it's wrapped in policy, culture, and what's best for you, you thank it. You blame yourself. You carry it into the next generation. We don't need to fear returning to the Middle Ages. We need to realize we never left. We just learned to whisper our punishments. But the pain still screams.